Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Trump visited Florida Friday for several events, including a campaign fundraiser that brought in $10 million. The trip comes one day after the state confirmed more than 11,000 new coronavirus infections and 93 additional deaths. That's its highest daily death toll since the pandemic began. Average daily cases there have reportedly jumped nearly 1,400% since the state reopened. During his visit, the president focused his remarks on the election. He took aim at Joe Biden, Democratic mayors, and protesters calling for the removal of controversial statues. Meanwhile, there are new developments in the case involving the president's former national security advisor. A federal appeals court Friday delayed a decision to dismiss the criminal case against Michael Flynn. Flynn's legal team and the judge in the case can now argue for a new hearing on that decision. Let's bring in Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Catherine is CBS News senior investigative correspondent. Hello to you both. Catherine, let me start with you. Take us through this move by the federal appeals court. What does this mean for Michael Flynn's case?
Well, Elaine, I spoke to a seasoned attorney here in Washington late today, and he advised me to pay close attention to the language in the order, specifically a section that says that this is being done on the court's own motion. So in other words, they are taking the initiative to decide whether to hear the Flynn issues as a full panel. And they also set the clock running. They're giving the parties 10 days to respond, specifically Flynn's legal defense team, and they are inviting the government to weigh in as well. And there's another key section to the order, and it cites something called Rule 41A3. And what that states is that Flynn's dismissal is on hold until the issue is decided by the appeals court as to whether they'll hear all of the issues as a full panel. But if they decide against it under this rule, the clock is ticking on 21 days, and then the writ to dismiss would go into effect, and that could be as early as sometime next week.
Wow. So it's so fascinating, Catherine. Is there any legal precedent, Catherine, that might hint at what could happen next?
Well, I preface that, Elaine, by saying that this is a case that is so extraordinary. Everyone is, in effect, coloring so far out the lines in terms of how legal cases typically proceed. But there is an important piece in case law, which is called the Fokker Services case in 2016. And significantly, that is a ruling that also came out of the Court of Appeals here in Washington. It was written by a senior judge on that panel. And what it found is that there's a clear separation of powers, that it's with the executive branch, in this case, the Justice Department. It is their sole discretion to decide whether to prosecute someone or to dismiss a case, which is what the situation is here with Flynn, and that it's the judiciary's sole responsibility to decide on issues of sentencing. So that's considered a very important piece of the case law, and I suspect we'll see that in the arguments going forward on whether a full panel should hear these issues.
Also, Catherine, records related to Flynn's case, including notes from the FBI and Department of Justice, were unsealed Friday. What actually stood out to you?
Well, to bring folks at home up to speed, a U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Missouri, Jeff Jensen, was tasked earlier this year by Attorney General William Barr to do an independent review of the Flynn case. And what's been happening over the last couple of months is Jensen has turned up these records, and many of them have been under seal. And these records are described as exculpatory evidence, so evidence that would have been helpful to Flynn's defense team, but they were not provided to them. And today, the court unsealed additional records, and the most important record is a draft memo. It's a government memo from January 30th, 2017. And the timing really matters here because this is just 6 days after then National Security Advisor Mike Flynn was interviewed by the FBI. And the draft memo says, in part, that while the FBI agents found discrepancies between Flynn's interview at the White House and these called transcripts of his conversations with the Russian ambassador, they still concluded that he was not acting as an agent of the Russian government. And that matters because for the following 2 weeks after January 30th, there was an effective and successful push to get Flynn out of the White House, and those are the events that led to his prosecution and ultimately his guilty plea to lying to the FBI.
Let's turn to another topic. So the president spoke to reporters before leaving for Florida, and he was asked about a potential pardon of his former associate Roger Stone. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Well, I'll be looking at it. I think Roger Stone was very unfairly treated, as were many people. And in the meantime, Comey and all these guys are walking around, including Biden and Obama, because we caught them spying on my campaign. Who would have believed that one? Thank you.
All right, so Catherine, first of all, what actions could the president take in Roger Stone's case?
Well, in Roger Stone's case, he could pardon him, which has the effect of wiping the slate clean. You know, he was convicted on federal charges of lying to Congress, among other issues. Or he could commute the sentence, which means that they leave the federal charges in place, but it means Stone does no jail time. And the timing here is really important. A source who's familiar with the discussions told CBS News that President Trump has been actively considering commuting Stone's case. And if he were to intervene, their expectation is that it would happen before Tuesday. And Tuesday matters because that is when Stone is supposed to report to a federal prison in Georgia.
All right, so Major, some analysis here, please. Is there a discernible political strategy?
Right?
Because, in addition to sort of the walking through and giving us the play-by-play, which Catherine always does so wonderfully, let's talk bigger picture. I did not mean to suggest you were not doing analysis, Catherine. No, not at all. I just meant let's zoom out a little bit, perhaps, is a better turn of phrase.
He's so smart on that. I love Major for that. So,
well, because we're going to shift and talk about just the nuts and bolts now, but the bigger context here, Major, which is perhaps my ham-handed way of, trying to kind of turn to the politics of this. Because the idea being, you look at the president's standing in the polls right now, and you look at these potential moves, which Catherine just spelled out, and the question becomes, is there some kind of discernible political motivation in a potential pardon for a Roger Stone, and even in being supportive of a case dismissal for Michael Flynn? Does that somehow, Major, boost the president's support in any way?
Well, it reinforces his coda of loyalty, and that loyalty proffered is loyalty sometimes rewarded. Not always, but sometimes rewarded. And in high visibility cases, it can be rewarded. And to Catherine's point, and she did, as you said, masterfully lay out all of the mechanistic qualities, the dates, the legal history, the precedent, all of that. Within Republican circles, over the 4th of July weekend, I began to detect via text and telephone calls Republicans saying, hey, the word is out that Trump is really working on this Stone issue. It could pop this weekend, meaning 4th of July weekend. It didn't. It's clear in the president's own words that this is a topic of importance and interest and dialogue. And as the president is always want to do, internally and externally, he reminds everyone, in case they're curious at this late date, who makes the final decision. He does. And it's his gut instincts and it's his orientation to the rule of law and justice that prevails, nobody else's. That it has gone on for a while suggests there is friction within the West Wing. I've detected that. I'm sure Catherine has as well. That doesn't mean nothing's going to happen to Roger Stone. It just means there's friction. In the Flynn case, everything that Catherine said is 100% true, as always, about the case law, the procedure, the process. The one big complication for the Flynn case, and it relates to that 2016 opinion that came out of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, that was about the executive branch's primacy in decisions about prosecution. Not, as I understand it, and Catherine, please correct me if I'm wrong, retroactively getting rid of a case in which a guilty plea has been voluntarily proffered, which is what happened. That's the great complication for Flynn and the Justice Department in this case. Whatever happened in the FBI misconduct or conduct, and many people on the right and the Trump supporters believe there was serious misconduct, the Justice Department Inspector General has tabulated that. In fact, others very well have added to that body of evidence. Flynn still pled guilty in his own words and said, "I do this voluntarily." Not once, but twice. That is a big sticking point, and it is why this still hasn't been resolved. And I think it is going to be one of the things the larger D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is going to want to consider when it decides what ultimately to do about that. That's why these are such uncharted legal waters. In both instances, Elaine, to get to your larger sort of thematic question, they reinforce the president thinks that there was a railroad attempt with either Flynn or Stone or others connected to him based on largely, if not from his point of view, entirely groundless suspicions, and that this has gone on too long and that there are victims, and he's going to try to look into whether or not he can remedy their victim status. And as Catherine pointed out, there's a clock ticking for Roger Stone. He doesn't want to go to that federal prison in Georgia on Tuesday. Why? Because he says over and over, it's a COVID hotspot. It's essentially a death sentence. That is theatrical as Roger Stone is, but it's not completely irrelevant to the underlying set of facts. Federal and state prisons are or can be areas of concern where COVID-19 is present. But the Tuesday deadline, such as it exists, is meaningful for the president and Roger Stone. So this weekend looms very large in that case.
Catherine, help clarify as well what we heard from the president in that soundbite about spying. It's something that we've heard from the president before. To what is the president referring when he talks about, quote unquote, spying?
Well, my interpretation of that language is that he's addressing the body of documents that has now come to light really as a result of the Jensen review over the last couple of months. And these are records that go to the fact, as we saw today, that there were conclusions at senior levels of the FBI that Flynn's story to agents may not have synced up exactly with the transcripts of the phone calls to the Russian ambassador, but they didn't detect that he was lying to them. And they also concluded, based on this draft memo that was released today, that he was not an agent of the Russian government. And that was, if you will, the pretext to leave this counterintelligence investigation open in January of 2017. Remember, on January 4th, the FBI moved to close that investigation because they had not found derogatory information about Flynn. But then at the 11th hour, Agent Peter Strzok intervened on the instructions of the executive floor at the FBI, and they left it open to further investigate these phone calls. So I believe that's what the president is referring to, these new documents, as well as the so-called unmasking list, which was declassified by the Director of National Intelligence. Those were officials in the last administration who asked that the American citizens be identified in these intelligence transcripts, and they identified General Flynn. The final point I would make on unmasking is that I've known people who have worked in the spy world for 2 decades, some of them very seasoned CIA officers, and when you ask them how often it was that they, quote, unmasked people in the course of their work, I've had people tell me, operatives tell me, that maybe they've done it 24 times in the course of their 30-year career, so that's not that often. And when you look at the numbers that were involved in the unmasking records at the end of the last administration, you see a significant spike. That may have reflected genuine concern at that time, and that's an issue that really the viewers at home will have to decide.
Yeah, interesting context there. Let's turn to the coronavirus pandemic. The president is continuing his push to get students back in the classroom this fall, but as we mentioned, cases are surging across the country. Major, why this push right now, and does it further highlight this disconnect between the president and the nation's top health experts?
Well, look, there's an economic imperative behind it, which means there's a political imperative behind it, but it doesn't mean it's divorced entirely from science or from medicine. So let's talk about the economic imperative. Look, the White House knows, as everyone also knows, the White House knows by data, and most of us know just from a common sense perspective, if children at the K through 12 grades are not back in school in the fall, their parents have a much more difficult time navigating whatever their work responsibilities are. And the reopening of the economy is dependent upon workers being able to work regular shifts in a predictable way. Much, much more difficult, vastly more complicated if, again, as it was in the late spring, this fall begins with no school in session. That's a huge complication and an economic one for the president. He needs a better economy. He needs signs of an optimistic economic, if not recovery, at least trend lines that are positive, not just the stock market, because that doesn't reflect the entire economy. So that's part of it. And that is where the politics also come in. But the American Association of Pediatrics, or whatever the formal name of that organization is, I might have bungled it there, has also said it's important for children to go back to school. I talked to Zeke Emanuel, who is an academic, a doctor, and an advisor currently on former Vice President Joe Biden's coronavirus task force. He told me on my podcast, The Takeout, this week, in the midst of this roiling debate, guess what? Kids need to go back to school. They can do it safely. It can be figured out, and it must be figured out, not just for their education, but for their parents' peace of mind and for the structural ability of America to adjust to this new normal and get about functioning on things of a high priority, which he believes elementary and secondary education is. So the president has an economic interest, which means there's a political interest, but it doesn't necessarily mean he is divorced from all science or medicine. He may be taking only part of that information in, but it's not as if he's by himself in this idea that K through 12 should be restarted and in many cases has to be restarted.
The clock is ticking. Fall is just around the corner. All right, Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge. Catherine, 1,000 apologies.
Oh, no, not
always,
at all. I totally
always
embrace
bow to your
Major's
superior reporting
assessment
and analysis. Let the record be clear on that.
analysis. It's okay. It was so much fun. Thank you.
All right.
We'll see you next time.
Have a great weekend, you guys. Thank you very much.
See ya. Bye.